Greetings to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. Dear learners, the topic of analysis that we shall deliberate is Feminist Concerns and International Security. Dear learners, in this lecture we shall try to understand main issues of the feminist perspective in international relations. We shall try to understand that how, when we look at the changing context of global relations, how gender is an important aspect for international security. This will also take us towards the debate on the changing dynamics of power, security, national interest in international relations, and most important, the need to enlist, take into account the hitherto excluded views in the study of global politics. So as we take the lecture today, we shall try to understand that how international relations is impacted by deliberations from the perspective of gender, the feminist views with respect to security and power in global relations. At the outset, we all know that feminism as an ideology, as a set of ideas, questions marginalization and exploitation of women. We all know that when we look at the biological perspective, both man and women are distinct. Now, when biological category is translated to build a form of a construct of discrimination, that is, when natural differences are used to differentiate, to build in biases in the form of a social construct of gender, here in which the aspect of nature versus nurture, the aspect of man versus women, using these binaries, IR makes the first platform to deliberate in, feminism makes the first platform to deliberate in IR. Dear learners, we all know that feminist ideas exist in all kinds of literature, political theory, literature, sociology, history, amongst others. But in the realm of international relations, feminism emerges late. Feminism raised voice, concerns about the complete neglect of issues with respect to when we try to understand power. There was absence of the feminist concerns. When we look at security, there was near absence of gender issues. When we look at the national interest, all of it is argued that they need to be perceived from the vantage point of gender equality and the feminist perspective. Further, as we are debating feminist approach in IR, we have to see that like any other approach, it is not a monolithic approach. It's not a single stream of thought. There are competing views, and these competing views give us the idea that how one perspective, idea, the object of the global world has been problematized by the feminist research and feminist epistemology in global relations. The liberal feminists focus on looking at the aspect of equality, the struggle for equal rights, the issues of representation. The Marxist feminists seek to change the exploitative, the oppressive socio-economic structures, namely getting in capitalism in the gendered discourse. The standpoint feminists argue that women's knowledge comes from a marginalized perspective, a perspective that has not been included or studied so far. And this perspective has the potential to provide fuller insights into world politics than those that form the core. The postmodern feminists argue against any kind of meta-narratives and any kind of grand theory. So dear learners, it's also very important to understand that how feminism emerges in international relations. Let's now understand the context for the same. We all know that IR has been perceived in the form of wars. It has been seen as a discipline of wars. And of course, history justifies it. The First World War was followed by the Second World War. The Second World War was followed by an ideological war in the form of the Cold War. Now, with the end of the Cold War, disintegration of Soviet Union, blurring down of the ideas of East versus West, the rise of increased interdependence and the rise of processes of globalization, no doubt there were major challenges within the core ideas of international relations. The core ideas of international relations stemmed from the realist perspective, namely that it is statism leading to survival, followed by the aspect of the need for self-help. Now, in this, what we find that with this changing context, one witnesses that state in the post-Cold War era is no longer the only actor in IR. There are research to back, our evidence to prove that how the role of global cooperation, international organizations, non-governmental organizations has broadened. Now, what we find here is that within this complex ambit, feminism also challenges, problematizes, contests the idea of what has been traditionally seen as standard or normal in the perspective in theorizing international relations. IR, as we see in terms of the policy debates and the literature, it attached a lot of significance to the war and the need to gain power. Feminism highlights the need to re-examine these ideas and thereby putting forward a very important argument that the theoretical foundations of the theories of IR are gender bias. The idea of neutrality conceals the gender differences. Further, the perspective of the world in the form of binaries, namely rich versus poor, young versus old. Within these binaries, feminism adds to the perspective of masculine versus the feminine. The new realists, when we try to revisit the theory of Kenneth Waltz, namely presenting forward the idea of anarchy, wherein the world was seen as anarchic with the lack of a centralizing agency responsible for the law and order chaos. Amidst this, the issues were of women, when we go by the debates presented by the feminist research, were perceived as being outside the zone of rational deliberation. Feminists disagreed with the arbitrary division, that's what they call, of what's national, what's international, and they bring the focus on the individual. Further, quoting from Tickner and Sochberg's work, that today's global system is constituted by socially constructed gendered hierarchies. They have led to subordination of women in international affairs. The feminist international relations ideas research, they problematize the billiard ball understanding that has been presented by the realist, which possess that international structures and policies of the state, how that impacts the international relations. Now, with this, feminists expand the scope of the term security to not just include the idea of security of borders of state territory, but also looking at the dichotomies inside, reflecting on the churnings, the crisis at the domestic internal aspect, that is security of women, say, at home. So therefore, what we see that how the traditional perspective of international security was that of power, of domination, and thereby power and domination being used to safeguard national interests. traditional theories, when we look at the feminist critique, they argue they have masculinized the idea of war. They have valorized, praised the idea of violence, and somewhere the ideas of peace and non-violence have been put at the back burner, just like feminist agendas. So therefore they say that how there is femininization of ideas of peace in international relations. And above all, feminists put forward that the ideas like peace, like caring, nurture have to be prioritized in global relations, in understanding of international security. The end of the Cold War, dear learners, we all know that it gave a lot of new thinking in IR. And herein we see that the idea of security, which was again seen in as we have discussed, in the form of a military perspective, the idea of security with the emergence of UNDP report in 1994, the work of Mehboob Haq, presented the idea of security as human security. Now this human security marks a shift, a transition from the traditional understanding of security. Now to give some example that how United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, if we go by UN.org resources, it made way for addressing gender issues with peacekeeping, with arms race, amongst others. Now what we see here is that human security brings the focus towards the individual. It takes the focus away from the state, and above all it identifies 7 aspects wherein which security has to be seen in a multidisciplinary, multidimensional way. An important work as we are discussing how feminist ideas problematize international security. We take reference to the work presented by Cynthia Enloe. Cynthia Enloe studies the role of women, taking the case study of the Iraq War. When we go by the work, it shows that how women upliftment was one of the key planks for the war. But rather what happened was militarization of women lives. So therefore wars are seen differently by men and women, and therefore the ideas, the events like, the concepts like war, power are gendered events in international relations theory. Further, feminists and other critical security scholars also believe that an economic dimension must be an essential part of the idea of security. Let's look around when we look at gender division of labor at homes as well as at workplaces, which definitely has an implication on the bigger picture of security, of welfare and of development. Now, what we see that in most avenues of life, women's labor, when we are discussing the economic aspect related to security, we find that how women's labor is either unpaid or insufficiently paid. When we look at sectors like agriculture, when we look at rise of global firms, there are several reports, and our commonality in such all reports cutting across respective nation states here is that there is a wage gap between men and women. Further, when we look at manufacturing economy, that how women are given light jobs like caregiving, human relations, all of it, the idea of wage gap, discrepancy, disparity of payment structures reinforce the pre-existing patriarchal notions of femininity, wherein a woman is seen at a lesser level and the male factor is responsible for ensuring welfare or security. And such idea of giving prevalence to the male over the female further work to the cause of marginalization, discrimination of women. Dear learners, we all know that realism gave significance to a lot of the 3S. We have read about it, that is statism, survival and self-help. To add to the idea of contract that comes in the idea of state, Carol Bateman questions the concept of consent, and in her book The Sexual Contract in 1988, it's argued that how social contract works in a way to legitimize, to perpetuate gendered hierarchy which is found in institutions, and thereby with all of it, patriarchy becomes the normally accepted norm. Further, when we look at work like Machiavelli's Prince, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, in all of it there is a paternal image perspective of the state, namely strong, autonomous entity that has to protect the people from chaos, the danger of the state of nature. And herein also the unequal gendered relations lead to vulnerability, exploitation of women, which make them dependent on men for their protection and welfare. So therefore, again, the questions that has been often asked, that how do we perceive women in the global practice of international relations? For example, when we look at international events, international news, the big question is, where do we situate women? Namely, it is argued that women are seen in the form of a supporting role. For example, how feminist theories in the work of Ruiz also show that how domain of international relation has been one of patriarchy. Then above all, today the idea of security has been contested in international relations, and therein which it is also important that along with this perspective that how wars are fought in the name of motherland, but how when after the struggle is over, women's concerns are placed at the back burner. The idea of nation is utilized as motherland, but however within the nation the issues of rising violence against women, crimes against women are somewhere shown and treated with the insensitive concerns by several governments. And then above all, when we are looking at the notions of war, power, how all of them are gendered, prevailing and paving way that works in a manner to work to the advantage of men over women, thereby perpetuating gendered inequalities. As we are discussing that how international security today is also a complex process, wherein which state exists with the non-state actors. Dear learners, one also has to see that how non-state actors and processes like globalization, multinational cooperation, the trade flows, the global financial system somewhere work in a manner that discriminate against the women. So by ignoring the hierarchical construction, their relevance and relationship and reference to maintenance of power is also presenting the risk of perpetuating the relationships of exploitation, domination and subordination. For example, in the process of working of globalization, it is often presented in research that how in the rural-urban dichotomy, it is the women that suffer the most. In the working of multinational corporations with the rise of 24/7 concern, how issues like cyber security, the need to have safe workplace forces, all of it which are integral to women are somewhere either sidelined or put at back burner. And therefore, for having a holistic expression of national interest for any nation, it's important to factor in the feminist concerns with globalization, global governance, the global flows of trade and finance, amongst others. Further, it's also important to see that how in the mainstream perspective also, women are underrepresented in legislative bodies, decision-making positions within the family also, and how today when we look at with processes like migrants, women comprise a higher proportion of migrants, namely the labor migrants. And with all of neglect of women concerns from representative aspect, from issues of the bigger picture of war and issue of nationalism, from the related issues of economic processes, cultural norms, societal impact, the neglect of feminist voices as feminist perspective has presented, it leads to unjust distribution of benefits and burdens. An important perspective here, which was presented by the socialist president Pedro Sanchez of Spain, giving significance to the idea of gender equality, that was by establishing Ministry of Equality. No doubt today every nation, approximately every nation, has an elaborate ministry to cater to women concerns. What is essential here is to work out gender mainstreaming in order to have women perspective rightly enlisted in international security, in order to sustain the perspective of ensuring due women voices in international security. Gender mainstreaming is important. That is, figuring it out, working out the inter-industry and inter-units and departments and intergovernmental coordination and negotiation with respect to taking into account the concerns of the women. So, as an epistemology, feminist views are a unique ethnographic approach that underline the significance, the importance of individual experiences, the social relations, rather than just placing international theorization on abstract state behavior and other abstract concepts. Feminist theorists, philosophers, work, they strive, they attempt to accurately reflect on, deliberate on the myriad interests, the diverse views, the experiences, the concerns of women throughout the world, and to take differences of culture, history, socio-economic and political circumstances. Women's knowledge and perspective and experiences therefore should be brought to light, should be brought to bear on the study of IR and their reflections on deeper insights of international security have brought into IR a deeper understanding of political and economic processes in IR also. It highlights the limits of the traditional frameworks like the mainstream frameworks like realism, neoliberalism, liberalism. So therefore, gender analysis should not be just seen as about adding women as an element of study, but an attempt to work out a concern, a concrete, a holistic picture of global relations, international relations theory by changing how and who do we study in domain of international politics. Dear learners, some very important works that you can take as reference. You must refer to the work by E.M. Abhyankar, that is Gender, International Relations and Development of Feminist Security. The work of Cynthia Enloe, Bananas, Beaches and Bases. Cynthia Enloe's work, Nemo's War, Emma's War, Making Feminist Sense of the Iraq War. Alison Jagger's Is Globalization Good for Women? The work of T. Ruiz, that is Feminist Theory and International Relations, The Feminist Challenge to Realism and Liberalism. Julie Steen's Gender in International Relations, An Introduction. Christine Sylvester, Feminist International Relations Theory, An Unfinished Journey. J. Ann Tickner, Hans Morgenthau, Principles of Political Realism, A Feminist Reformulation. J. Ann Tickner, Gender in International Relations, Feminist Perspectives on Achieving Global Security. J. Ann Tickner and Sojbert Laura's work, that is Feminism, that's there from Tim Dunn's and Steve Smith and Korki Milja's book, that is International Relations Theory. So dear learners, we hope you all gained significant insights into how today the discourse of international security is much more contested, complex and multidimensional, within which the gendered views, the perspective of feminism indeed adds more to our understanding of war, power, freedom struggle, nationalism, economic processes, societal impact, cultural norms, amongst others. Thank you for being with us for the lecture.